Welcome everyone to this installment of the Hunt Institute's Postsecondary Pathways webinar. We'll give people 2 more minutes to log on, so 2 more minutes and then we'll get started. All right, well, we will go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone again for joining us today for another installment of the Postsecondary Pathways webinar. Today we're going to be talking about vaccine mandates. Will they stick? That was my horrible play on words, but I hope you enjoyed it. We know as higher education institutions have returned to campus in the spring of 2022, leaders are grappling with the various implications of COVID-19 and the vaccine mandates and various mitigation strategies, as well as the laws that govern all of these decisions. The constantly shifting environment of the pandemic, coupled with changing FDA and CDC approvals, have made this conversation an important one for education leaders. We've got a great set of panelists today who are going to discuss some of the current best practices around vaccine requirements, its implications on equity and access, and how these change the future of post-secondary education. So with that, we will go ahead and get started. I want to remind the audience that we are following along on Facebook Live. And then we also, if you want to follow us on Twitter, you can follow the Hunt Institute at Hunt_Institute, and you can tag us or follow along at the hashtag Postsecondary Pathways, Postpathways. With that, we'll go ahead and bring in our amazing group of panelists to get started. First, we'll go to Chelsea Dobb. Chelsea Dobb, Dr. Dobb is a knowledge instructional design specialist at McKinsey & Company, where she works at the intersection of human behavior, learning design, and societal development. Chelsea, thanks for being here today. Can you tell us a little bit about how vaccination and their mandates have affected human behavior and equity issues associated with vaccination?
Absolutely. Thanks for inviting me, Wynn. I'm so excited to be able to speak to people across North Carolina, across the country, and hopefully across the globe. And also greetings to my co-speakers as well. I'm very excited to engage with you all. It looks like we have a comment that someone does not have sound. Can you all hear me? Can you hear me?
It may just be that one. Looks
okay.
like several yeses. So we'll try to get someone from our tech team to connect with you, Renee, and see if we can get you.
Great. As a facilitator, I always try to pay attention to the chat as I'm speaking. But yeah, as we think about vaccinations and human behavior, there's a lot involved, right? And so I tend to think about this in 3 different buckets: source credibility, rapid behavior change, as well as simply dignity. And I'll start with credibility. We're in an era of news where we receive news, information, data, knowledge, all of these things in multiple outlets, whether that's through social media, through watching a traditional television, reading research online, engaging with different forums and things of that nature, scientific journals, right? We have all of, we're inundated with information. And I think this really has an impact on how people really perceive themselves within this full narrative of a pandemic. When you're overloaded with too much information, it's often very difficult for humans in general to process information quickly, unless you're part of the rare group of people who is really able to process, execute, and move forward in a way that makes sense for all of humanity. But what we really have to understand and be patient with throughout this process is that it can be confusing. We're getting different messages every day from different sources that we were previously very confident in, and then sources now that we have many of us have lost confidence in. And I'm not going to name any specific sources in this talk, but I will say that it really how we receive and digest and apply the new information that we now have can be it can be traumatizing for some people, right? And some people may tend to retreat or withdraw or try to ignore. Some people may lean in and try to find out their own information, come up with their own theory or understanding. But in general, it can be very difficult to really understand what is true and what makes sense for myself and my family. And that is a constant struggle in any aspect of our life, right? But then as we move forward, as we think about, okay, I have this information. I know these facts. I know these things may have been scientifically proven. I've received a ton of evidence on effectiveness and outcomes of different populations. But this also the receiving and the behavior change can vary culturally, through different genders, through different regions, through different belief systems. And we really have to think intentionally around how does diversity really play into this messaging and the knowledge that we're receiving, right? One of my favorite I would say researchers is Collins Arhambua. He was previously head of human development and family studies at Penn State University. And he came up with the Penn 3 model. And the Penn 3 model really narrows in on how can we impact behavior change in Africa around people who have contracted HIV or high HIV areas or highly populated HIV areas. And so he looks at, the ideas of cultural identity, relationships and expectations, and empowerment as methods to really impact change, right? And we think about our own identities, what we bring to the table. As a Black woman, I know that, we have a lot of trauma historically through, vaccines and research studies and things that have been done physically to our bodies that has deterred many of us from trusting systems that we should be trusting at this point in time. But then also I have different relationships with people in my community, in my workspace, with my family, who also have differing opinions on how we should be operating and moving forward. And then lastly, being empowered to make decisions that are best for myself and my community can be challenging. We move through this, as you think about behavior change in general, we think about, the stages of change, of pre-contemplation to contemplation, to action. And some of us are really able to move from pre-contemplation to action very quickly. And some of us need time to be empowered to have, those difficult conversations with family members and really understand what it means to be, people who are marginalized and now are being told to do something that is, outside of our purview of what humanity typically looks like, right? And so many of us as children, we received vaccines, we're young. Our parents may have had a choice, but we didn't necessarily have a choice. But now we're in this phase of, okay, I now have a choice to protect myself, protect others. But what does that mean for me in the long run? What does that mean for my health immediately in the long term? How does this impact my day to day, right? We have all of these bubbling questions that are really just continuously arising every day. And that brings us to the last point of understanding what dignity means in this moment. As we think about, equity issues that persist through higher education, post-secondary education, with many marginalized populations and a number of different facets of diversity, we really come back to this central idea of enabling people to feel like they are experiencing dignity as a means to belong, right? And sometimes that doesn't shine through in the best way possible. Sometimes our messaging, our communication, our mandates can seem restricting. They can seem to be pulling us in a direction that we may not be fully comfortable with. And so it really comes back to this communication of not only our own understanding, but how we're communicating with the world and how we see ourselves as a part of this larger effort to create healthy outcomes among humanity. So I hopefully that answers some of your questions.
Absolutely. And thank you for that, Chelsea. This experiencing dignity as a means of belonging, I think really stuck with me. And this idea that, we're overloaded with knowledge, and how do we help students work through that information to make a decision that's best for them. So thank you for providing that perspective, and I look forward to diving deeper into it.
Absolutely.
Next, we're going to move to President Thompson he is the president of the Kentucky Postsecondary Council on Higher Education, where he works to ensure all Kentuckians have equal opportunity to improve their lives through post-secondary education. President Thompson, throughout this, you've navigated coordinating the various institutions across the state of Kentucky. Can you tell us a little bit about that and their response to vaccinations?
Sure. Thanks, Wayne. Good to see everybody. Good to be here. A couple of points I want to make. A mandate is a mandate. You're telling someone to do something. You can call it a choice if you like, but it is telling someone. And in that regard, behavioral modification sometimes takes some nuance. For us, and I'll give a much more of an operational definition. I think Chelsea did a great job of laying out some of the motivations or some of the things we need to be cognizant of as we talk about this. I will lay out maybe a little more practical output, since it was my job to make sure that people in Kentucky did several things. And I'm talking about higher ed, whether it's private higher ed or public higher ed, and that is to ensure that they were getting a quality education that was equitable, true enough, but was keeping them safe at the same time. So those nuances are kind of interesting when you think about behavioral modification, right? When you're telling someone we're going to keep you safe if you come to the campus, but if you get a shot, you'll be safer. But yet, taking into consideration, there's all different kinds of folk that come to our walls. So let me start by saying this. We are a state that is made up of we're highly rural in many ways. We are a low educated state, but we're improving every day. We're a state that has urban communities that's highly of color, but we're also a state that, in fact, in many cases, probably aren't used to a lot of mandates. So how do we manage that? And so what we did, we took what I once again argue to be practical steps. We did not mandate. The governor allowed me to have the kind of authority with our presidents to decide what we do. And in order not to mandate, we had to have a lot of communication. In order not to mandate, we had to have cautionary ways of approaching higher ed as a whole. We stayed open. We came back in the fall face to face, but we also did a lot of other things. Once again, I'm talking about behavioral modification a little bit. We tested. And if you, in 2020, if you received the vaccine, well, then you didn't have to be tested. But if you didn't, you had to be tested every week. So depending on where institutions were at, and this is where I'm going to take the equity issue into consideration. If we were a community college in one of our highly rural areas, we had far more of an issue convincing folk that vaccines were important to keep them safe and keep their fellow students safe. If we were at the University of Kentucky, which is a research institution with a healthcare system in place that did a lot of testing on a regular basis, I mean, we got to 90-something% vaccinations without a mandate. So, but we also did, it was a different, what I would consider to be a motivation taking place there. I couldn't test. as much in the rural areas. I didn't have as nice of an access to a healthcare system. So that's where equity took really an issue for us. Yes, we did have issues, historically speaking. The Tuskegee experiment came back to haunt us with many of our people of color, no doubt about that. So it took folk like us who represented that community a conversation along those lines of what it means to, in fact, to keep yourself safe and others safe. But it also took this added benefit. What would it be like if we did not get an education? Now, sooner or later, we're probably going to talk about whether or not we are behind in the academic endeavor based on COVID, whether it's P12 or higher ed. Well, the argument is that higher ed anyway here, that we needed to keep that academic endeavor up at all costs. So we had to keep people safe. So even within the circumstances where people were tested positive, we would have an isolation area, or we would help them quickly be put in a place whereby they could continue their education, but keep, other folks safe. What ended up happening then, we had lower COVID rates in all of our institutions, much lower than the wider community we were within. And we had, we also were contained. You would have thought we would have had more, but that containment allowed us to have continuous conversations about equitable education, continuous conversation about equitable access to healthcare, continual conversations about what it means to actually be a part of a community that was vaccinated and how that would continue their educational endeavor. So equity then took on a systematic approach to us. And I'll add one other item before I stop here, and we'll talk later, I'm sure, is that I'm also the chair of the board of the largest healthcare system in Kentucky. We did mandate vaccinations for a reason. And we were told we were going to lose all kinds of people, but I think we ended up out of 29,000 something people, we may have had 10 people quit. The reason why, because in many cases, it is about education. It is about taking the time to explain before you, in fact, impose. So will mandates stick? They will stick if we take the behavioral lessons we've learned and turn it into attitudinal processes that they can use. That really shaping the conversation around research and data, shaping it with the people that look like the communities that they serve, shaping it with truly the understanding it's not about politics, it's not about a variety of other things that people have made it about, but it is about not only continuing to keep yourself and others safe, but continuing, in our case, in keeping the academic endeavor in place in order for us to build the educated workforce, to build the economy that we need. So I hope this conversation talks about it beyond just the mandate, but to the motivations by which we can get to a point where we may not have to mandate, but in fact, it becomes a part of the nomenclature, the part of the culture, of the part of the milieu of how we do business.
Thank you for that, President Thompson, and appreciate you adding that context of all the mitigation strategies, because we know that we're not going to get out of this pandemic just simply by vaccines and how there's so much more. And I think one of the parts that stuck with me was you talking about understanding the characteristics of the students at the different institutions and the resources that they have there, and the difference between like your research school at University of Kentucky versus some of your more rural schools. So thank you for adding that context. Next, we'll go to Melissa Holloway. Melissa is General Counsel and Vice Chancellor for Legal Affairs, Risk, and Compliance at North Carolina A&T University. Melissa, Dr. Thompson gave us some of that from the SHIO perspective, the working across the state. You're on campus at an institution. So can you tell us more about how North Carolina A&T approached the conversation around vaccinations for students, faculty, and staff?
Of course, Winnie, and thank you very much. And thank you for the Hunt Institute for the invitation. I don't often get to serve on panels with such smart people. And so the first thing I'll say is that when we were starting this conversation, We had smart people on our team, but to be honest, I wish I'd had both of these folks on my team. We may have worked through this a lot more quickly and easily. But I am at North Carolina A&T State University here in Greensboro. And of course, we are part of the UNC system. So we are a public institution here in North Carolina. And for many of you, you see many of the institutions, private institutions in North Carolina were able to mandate the vaccine. We were unable to do so. And as a lawyer, I could spend probably the rest of the time on this webinar discussing the analysis of why our system believed we could not do so. But in the end, we did not have a mandate. And so we found ourselves very quickly in the same place where Dr. Thompson found himself, in an exercise in enterprise risk management. And I think almost everyone on this call used the term mitigation. And so a big part of my role is to help not only address, identify, and mitigate legal risk, but compliance risk, regulatory risk, and other risks to our campus. And absent all the negatives of the COVID pandemic, COVID is definitely one of the largest scale enterprise risk management exercises that I have ever participated in. It is an activity where every member of our campus, faculty, staff, or students were impacted. Our facilities, our operations, sort of the key to what we were here to do, and that's to educate our students. And so we had to very quickly decide how we address some of the behavioral issues that we knew would be a challenge without a vaccine mandate, or even with a vaccine mandate, to convince members of our community to, in the beginning, test, but then also to become vaccinated. And now as we move toward beyond vaccinations and boosters, to be boosted. And so for us, we had to address a number of things. Our campus sits right in the middle of East Greensboro, which is a large community of color where there was some mistrust as it relates to the vaccine. And so very early on, we decided that we would mandate testing. And so we mandated testing. We became involved and engaged in testing. We were one of the first large-scale testing sites in our community. We allowed access from not only our faculty, staff, and students, but community members. We hosted one of the first drive-through testing events in one of our large parking lots. And then we did other things to help the community as we had to adjust to COVID. We opened our parking decks as Wi-Fi stations for local high school students who might not have access to Wi-Fi so that they can continue their education. We tried to provide resources, whether it be hotspots, computers, and other things. And so we engaged with our community as we all were being impacted in the same way. And so that was very, very important to us. The other thing is that we had to deal with the sense of community on our campus. And so when you think about a historically Black college or university sitting in a community of color, we not only sit in this community, we're part of the community. And so we had to subscribe to that sense of community, that the only way for us to keep our campus safe is to keep each and every member of our community safe. And so that early testing, we also have to utilize some of the research capabilities that we have. So not only did we test, we decided to do wastewater testing and some other things to help identify COVID on our campus. And so very similar to Dr. Thompson, we were seeing rates that were so low as compared to our local communities that it was almost scary. At some point, we thought we may be misleading ourselves. And I'll tell you the one thing that we were able to do. Our campus was one of the first campuses to really implement the use of rapid testing before rapid testing was popular. We were able to get access to many, many rapid tests. We would use that wastewater testing, identify pockets, go into a residence hall, go into a building, do immediate rapid testing, and then able to isolate or have employees return home. And so we were able to keep those rates low. We came back to campus and we saw many of our system peers return to campus and then have to close down within the first several weeks of the school year. And I can tell you that message was not lost on our students. And so it was that sense of community, that sense of belonging, that recognition that communities of color, low-income communities have been more impacted by the COVID pandemic and by the disease in itself. And if nothing else, as you travel throughout the community, as you go home to visit grandma or grandpa, or you go home to visit your parents, the last thing that you want to do is to take a dangerous infection home to them. So test often, test early, test when you're leaving campus, test when you come back to campus. And so for us, it was that testing that was very, very important. We continued that testing mandate, giving people the opportunity to opt out of testing once the vaccination was readily available. So again, we transformed our Alumni Event Center to a mass vaccination site, not only for our faculty and staff, but also for our students. And we've had really good success, not only with enhancing the vaccine rate on our campus, but within the local community. The same when the vaccine became available for younger children, we opened up our doors to do that. Now, I will say this, and I think Chelsea talks about this very well, there's going to be hesitancy. There's going to be distrust. The healthcare system has not always seen as one that can be trusted by members of our community. And so we've had to work very diligently to address the science, address the conspiracy theories, address the misunderstanding. And we recognize that there will always be some level of our community that are not interested in vaccinations. And so we'll continue to test. And so for us, it was truly that sense of community, not only on our campus, but within the larger community, I think that kept us open. And so we've have had as much success as many of the public institutions that have mandated the vaccine. And I think we will continue to do so. And so I think lastly, I'll say that from an equity standpoint for us, it was important to ensure that our students were able to continue their educations here on campus. We know that this is where our students do well. We saw many people that struggled as we transitioned to the online environment. And I think Dr. Thompson mentioned years from now, we may be doing a study of the impact on the education of students who were educated during this pandemic and whether their outcomes look the same as those that came before them and hopefully those that will come after them. And so for us, it was about getting our students here, maintaining our core educational function, fulfilling our ongoing mission, not only to educate our students, but to serve and be engaged in our community. And so without a vaccine mandate, we had to appeal to not only the behavioral aspects of our community, but also the research and educational tools that we have here to assist not only our campus, but also the greater, larger community as well as the state.
Great, thank you for that, Melissa. And you know, it kept coming up this the idea of how important the community and surrounding, you know, that idea of the town and gown, that our institutions sit within side of a greater city, a greater town, that all influences it. Throughout this whole conversation, I've been picking up on this idea that it's not simply enough to mandate without having the knowledge, having the mitigation strategies, helping students understand the information and why decisions are made the way they are. So I want us to dive a little deeper into that. We've got about 12 minutes for the panelists for one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience for Q&A. So any audience members, just remember the Q&A function. We'll sort through those and get your questions answered. But I want to come back to you, Dr. Dobb. You know, talking about this idea of knowledge, information that you mentioned earlier, and how we process through that. Given the ever-changing pandemic, the rise of the Omicron variant, and the need for booster shots, how do you envision these conversations changing and evolving over the next year?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I was clairvoyant or had some type of precognition skills in which I could predict into the future, but I hope that there's this collective understanding that we really need to be realistic, while also simultaneously understanding both the need for independence and autonomy, especially among underrepresented and marginalized populations. Part of my background is in public health. And so when this all broke out, I immediately thought of the news I found out in 2020 about Africa, the continent eradicating polio in 2020. And it made me think, when did the Americas eradicate polio? And we eradicated polio in the 1990s, around like 1994, right? And that's a wide gap in terms of eradication of a deadly disease that impacted people across the globe, right? But I hope that we're able to really recognize the impact and understand our truest sources, and what they're saying around the future of our humanity, the future of our ability to be resilient, and our ability to really accept what is in front of us. I think it's been a shock for many people as you think about mental health and all the things that have happened in communities across the globe. People have responded to these things differently, and I think being able to move into that understanding of there is an opportunity for autonomy, independence, independent decision making, and our a will to move forward in a way that works for us. So long as we find collective harmony in the process, right? So long as we find understanding, right? And the fact of the matter is we probably will need regular boosters. I'm not a physician, but I mean, my background is in public health. I studied epidemiology for years. And I will say that it's important to understand that this is not something that can just go away by the end of the year, or will be eliminated by an X number of weeks, because we do not have a universal healthcare system, because health disparities exist in so many facets across our communities, both here in the States and across the world. But ultimately, my hope is that we grow stronger and really find this sustainable understanding and this collective understanding that it is not simply about me, it is about the future of the human race and the future of our humanity. One quote that I really love from one of my favorite authors is Audre Lorde. She's just phenomenal. If you've never read any of her works, I highly encourage you, explore anything. They're all phenomenal. But she has a quote when speaking specifically about feminism, in which she says, "I am not free while any woman is unfree, even when her shackles are different from my very own. I am not free when any woman is unfree, even if her shackles are very different from my own." And so I think about that constantly as we think about the pandemic and this I mentality, this independent mentality, that I'm doing what I can. It's not my fault that other people are not. I do not have responsibility to, help other people understand, right? And so I hope we're able to get to this point of realizing that our freedom rests on our ability to lean into helping others, to helping other people understand, to eliminating these disparities and actually creating meaningful and sustainable equity for generations. So ultimately, I hope these conversations move towards an idea of this is not just something that's happening in my community, but it's something I should be embracing for all communities, right? As we think about vaccination and mitigation of all of these different disparities that we're experiencing, but moving from that I and those me concepts to we and community, in hopes that we're not just finding strength in the time that we're experiencing right now, but we're simply finding understanding and empathy and care and concern in a way that makes sense for the eradication of COVID-19.
Thank you so much for that, Chelsea. And that's in the time that I've known you, in our conversation about public health, that's one of the things that you've really instilled in me, is that public health is so much more than an individual decision. It's the community, it goes global. And so those conversations have to include that when we're having these discussions. So thank you for bringing that context in. I really appreciate it. President Thompson, we're going to come back to you. You mentioned in your conversation earlier about how Kentucky is home to many rural students. How has this affected the ability of you and your team to disseminate information in vaccinations across the Commonwealth?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I should have started out earlier by saying I'm a social scientist, which means that I look at behaviors. I look at processes that create behavior. And I want to go back to the polio vaccine. One of the things that we noticed that was different between that vaccine and this vaccine is the word mandate. I mean, it wasn't done with the polio vaccine. It was just done. It was accepted as the given of the time. Because of social media, because of other media, because of a variety of things and words that have been politicized beyond what you can imagine, then that becomes much more of the conversation than, in fact, health. So what we've done and what we did during this process, we studied as we did. In other words, we looked at exactly how we could get the information out to all of our students, no matter where they were at, and the faculty and staff, I should say also, and how then we could back that up with the needed items, from PPP to testing to even vaccines. or how they could even store it. I mean, no one's even talked about that. The mRNA came out early. We didn't have the kind of freezers in many of our rural communities to even keep those by relative comparison to our urban communities. And I can keep on going forever with that. But the point I want to make, Wynn, in answering your question is that we had to then get on our feet, basically, to communicate. It was far more mouth to mouth, word to word, and localized in the way that we were doing it. I call it cultural competence. It was focusing truly on the culture and the behavioral patterns of that community and talking about them in the language and communication that was very apropos to that community. We had to do that with many of our urban African-American communities, to be honest with you. So it is about that. But one of the things that the presidents and I talk about, and some of you have heard me say before, that we can't wait to get over COVID to think about innovation because of COVID. We have to do it as we do it. And so one of the things that we're doing now, we're using AI, artificial intelligence, to do predictive patterns in communities to get them the information the way they need it now. I mean, we just employed a group that's sending out these nudges in the way that that community can understand to give them real facts, real data, real process, real protocol, and know how to get it there to them. While at the same time on our end, we had to be the folks that make sure that they had access to it once they were ready for it. So 4 things I want us to think about here. The question is, will they stick? I'm not sure if mandates will stick the way we've shaped it, right? It's been too messed up. What I know will stick are those strategies, those mitigation strategies, those inputs. And number 2, that has to create the continuous improvement process that makes it better over time, because this won't be the last pandemic we have. And I'm not sure we'll ever get rid of COVID, but this surely won't be the last pandemic we ever had. So number 3, how do we learn from our mistakes behaviorally? How do we learn from the mistakes that many of our people of color that had already received less than good health care, many of our low income, less than good health care? How then do we put in place those other precursors before we get to the pandemic that help them to get that and be ready with their immune system once they get it? So number 4, and I think this is important, we have to be able also to know how to use social media, regular media. We've got to figure out, those of us who are in the same room, to not let politics become the dictation by which we do good work. But let those items, and once again, I'm an educator, let those items with the facts, with the research, and with the people of those communities that we serve become an integral part of shaping not only the dialogue, but the results that are needed for that community to help that community to thrive. So we're called at all these different institutions, education, healthcare, criminal justice even, right? Or many of the places that people were in total confinement that we saw it flare up faster. All of these folks have to come together and say, what do we use now in an innovative way to create those items that we get out there now and not wait till another pandemic comes to get it out? So there's a lot more I could say about that. I'll leave it alone so Melissa will have a chance to jump in here. But I'm just saying, let's start talking about what it means to be culturally competent to those communities that we're talking. Let's not talk at them, but let's talk with them to help design a system that's continuously improved to make sure that we don't experience this again.
Yeah, thank you for that, President Thompson. The cultural competency is so important. And, as we were talking yesterday, I think people hear the word rural and you make an assumption about who that is. And just like you stated, from the plains of Western Kentucky to the mountains in Eastern Kentucky, that's rural areas, but those are still completely different cultures. And so how you connect with those. So thank you for sharing that. Well, final question before we open it up to Q&A, but I want to come back to you, Melissa. North Carolina A&T State University is one of the 10 HBCUs in North Carolina. President Thompson mentioned the Tuskegee experiment earlier and the horrors it's created within the Black community and the systemic inequalities we see in our healthcare system for Black students and Black Americans. How does that history and the history of HBCUs affect the way you do your work with your students, faculty, and staff?
Great question. And I think it has impacted everything we've done within the COVID pandemic. So we recognize that for communities of color, there may be a distrust. But when you think about HBCUs, when you think about other local organizations, churches, we have always had a history of community activism. We've always been the place where people have turned for what they believe would be accurate information as it relates to a number of areas. And so for us, the pandemic, the veracity of testing, the viability and the trustworthiness of the vaccine, our communities turned for us for that information. And they wanted it to be knowledgeable, they wanted it to be relevant, and they wanted it to be appropriate. So when you think across our campuses, we are dealing with some of the same issues as Dr. Thompson, from East Carolina to North Carolina to our larger research institutions with healthcare institutions. And so we had to continue the same sense of activism that we had as we pushed through integration and voting rights as we did with the pandemic and the vaccine. And so I think I talked about this earlier, our engagement with the community, providing testing here on our campus, providing a site for the vaccine. My chancellor and his first lady were vaccinated live stream on Facebook so that the members of our campus community could see that our senior leadership were going to be the first in the fight to protect our campus. And so it has been part of the underpinnings of all of this. And we've talked about the inequities. We've talked about the distrust, and we've not tried to convince people that we've moved forward, because we know that in many aspects we have not. We've just tried to convince people that in an effort to protect your own family, to protect your community, and to protect the campus community, that this is important, whether you decide to regularly test or to get vaccinated. And so when you think about all the work that all of the panel members have done and the discussions that we've had, this will continue. The pandemic has changed the nature of higher education as we know it. And we're not at the tail end of it yet. So we know the changes that we've experienced to date. We're not quite sure where we'll land on the other end. And so for us and for an HBCU, we have to determine, how does that move us forward? And we're already having those discussions about what have been the positive aspects of this enterprise risk management exercise that will move us forward more successfully. How will we engage with the community? How will we continue if there is a second set of boosters, or if we're able to mandate? And so I think it's just at the underpinning of all we do. It's always been there. And so our approach to the pandemic was our approach to every community and equity problem that we deal with, whether it be health disparities, food deserts, voting inequalities. And so it's just been at the underpinning. And I think that is probably one of the things that has helped our success.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think it's great to hear, leading by example, utilizing something like Facebook Live to show that to the community, and then continuing to realize that the pandemic's not over, and as we continue to change and evolve, how do we continue to find the best practices and change those that aren't getting the results that we're looking for. Well, panelists, you've been great. I want to open it up to the audience for Q&A. I had one come in, and I think I'll come back to you first, Melissa, but someone asked, based on the recent announcement by the federal government to put more tests out into the system, and we know the backlog of many tests and the ability to get them, how has this affected the ability for schools and institutions to do testing and actually have the supply to do testing for everyone?
So the one thing I'll say is that we have never struggled with a supply of tests. And I talked about this earlier. We were able to deploy the rapid test in a very strategic way to identify individuals who may be infected with the virus, and then follow with the PCR. The big issue now is processing time. So, for many of us, we have students living in very close proximity together in residence halls and other spaces. And if I am experiencing symptoms and tests, it won't be very helpful if it takes me 4 or 5 days to get that test result and I'm needing to isolate and quarantine. And so we have utilized sort of the combination of the different testing strategies, not only with our students, but with the community. And so we've not seen a backlog in testing per se. It's really those results. We've had access to tests. I know in the community, we've been fighting to enhance our clinic because we know that many people were not able to get access to home tests. They wanted to get tested before they traveled home for the holidays or upon return. And so we've expanded our on-campus testing to try to deal with some of the community backlog that folks have been experiencing. And the hope is that we'll see many more tests out there. The viability of some of those tests, you know, we're still in the throes of determining which test is the most valid test, and should I be testing in multiple ways to confirm whether I have COVID. As someone who had a cold last week and received a PCR, and still ultimately no COVID, thank God. But I think that's something we're gonna have to look into and determine what those resources look like and how often we're testing and how regularly testing, especially if you're mandating weekly testing for those that are not vaccinated and you have a larger unvaccinated population.
Thank you for that. And Chelsea, I have a new question for you, but I want to give President Thompson a chance if you have anything you want to add on that supply of testing.
Well, yes, I do. Actually, it's we have a tale of two cities still. In some of our institutions, we can get testing easier and out there. Some of our institutions, not so much. It's also, you're right, having the labs to get the information back to you quick enough that it matters. I mean, but I do want to say this. I know the president issued an order to get a lot of tests out. Now you have to get those distributed somehow. So, I mean, it sounds good from one end. On the back end, I tell you, as someone who had to deal with this on a regular occasion with many institutions in our state, 40 institutions, it is a tale of two cities, and also the people that can actually go through and do this and how often you test. And when you have students on a campus that live off campus, that come back on campus, then when do you test? I mean, so it's also the way you do the work. So in addition to testing, there's ways that we can identify when someone needs the test or when someone can self-identify to stay home or isolated. A variety of things. It's going to get to a point sooner or later, I argue. It's kind of like if you know you're sick and you got a cold and you got a flu, stay at home. Something's going on, right? Don't bring it in. So a part of it goes beyond testing, but it goes to a way that we can actually talk about what are those behavioral elements that we need to put in place, maybe even before you do a test. So there's a lot of, it sounds good whether you have access to tests or not based on what's coming to your state, getting them, doing it, even the importance maybe or not of doing them, I think needs to become a part of the conversation.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that's a critical part of that conversation. Chelsea, I want to come to you. One of the questions that was posed by our audience was this idea that, we discussed many best practices for institutions and practitioners, but a lot of our audience watching this work in nonprofits, they work for local or state governments. What can people sitting outside of institutions of higher education do to support students and even the institutions in disseminating some of this information?
Yeah, that's a great question, Wynn. And I think it kind of parallels a previous question around dignity and people who choose not to get vaccinated, right? I think I personally find myself as a learning designer engaging in conversation, building courses, conducting workshops on things such as having difficult conversations, becoming a more empathetic leader, and things of that nature. And so as we think about these really hard and challenging topics that we're trying to help people understand, I think having a truly listening ear and really understanding where people are coming from and hearing their perspective and removing your bias from those situations, and also hopefully helping them see their biases as well, as they think about their own decision making and choices. But I will say is, as we grow to support students from across the globe, it really comes down to having those conversations, those one-on-one conversations, and being able to empathetically listen without judgment, and hear people's concerns, so that they do feel heard and understood and experience that dignity that we're all searching and longing for.
Thank you for that, Chelsea. And that's so incredibly important. Thanks for hitting on that question that came in. I think I want to actually bring that to you, Melissa, as well. How have you all respected the dignity of those that have chosen to not get vaccinated while also keeping them safe on campus?
So I think number one, I'll put my lawyer hat back on. So even in cases where there is a vaccine mandate, we recognize that individuals will choose for a number of reasons to not be vaccinated or can't be vaccinated. So when you think about the vaccine mandates, there's the religious exemptions that of course are available to individuals who have sincerely held religious beliefs that don't support the vaccine. The same for those who have other belief systems or medical exemptions or medical conditions by which they don't believe the vaccine will sort of fit their medical needs. And so I think that's one piece of it. But I think number two, for us, we mandated testing. And so we have a regular series of testing, weekly testing for students, weekly testing for faculty, those that have chosen not to be vaccinated. We've tried to provide incentives and encouragement, but we recognize that for some people, this is not a choice. And so number one, that list of individuals is not readily available. As a supervisor, I don't know the vaccination status of my employees. And so I'm not sort of making decisions about whether people attend in-person meetings or do other things. And so we've tried to respect the autonomy of our community. We've tried to give them the information they need to make a well-informed choice, but we recognize in the end, the choice is theirs. And so for us, that has just not happened because we've managed this from a perspective of here are the choices that are available to you: a vaccination, a booster, a test, whatever that might be. You decide what that choice is, and no one gets to question what choice you've made. And so from my perspective, we've not seen that, and we haven't really expressed one way or the other what our perspective is, except that we want to keep our campus safe. And I think as a community, that is a shared goal that we all subscribe to. And so we just make the choices that we believe are in our best personal interest to be able to protect ourselves as well as all of the members of our larger community.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for that. I think in these last few minutes, I have one more question for you, President Thompson, and then we'll do a quick popcorn round to close this out. But President Thompson, I just wanted to ask you, you're considered a SHEO, a State Higher Education Executive Officer, which means you're one of the top level officials in your state. There's a SHEO in all 50 states. What has coordination looked like across your level, and what are some of the best practices you've seen emerge?
Sure, and we're different kinds of SHEOs with different kinds of powers in each state, so no one size fits all. Talk about equity a little bit. What we did in Kentucky, then I'll tell you what the conversations that I'm having. I'm also on the executive committee of the National SHEO organization. What we did in Kentucky, we brought all different people to the table and we talked about best practice, but not just best practice from a standpoint of what other people are doing in other states, but for us. And so we created with several goals in mind. One is to make sure we keep positivity rates down. One, to make sure that students have a viability to get the kind of learning that they need to be successful. But thirdly, how can we avoid or use our knowledge during this time to really do what we do better? So around the nation, you had different people doing different things. There were some that were more mandated than others within any given state. We had, in our state even, we had some private institutions that mandated, some that didn't, but our COVID rates stayed pretty good no matter whether it was mandated or not. What we've seen in other states are similar sorts of outcomes. We meet on a regular basis, have over the last 2 years, and that's what we talk about. What can we do that another state is doing that we can employ to make that state that we're living in better? And so that's the way we've done it. And I will tell you that in Kentucky, we had a lot more autonomy in higher ed than some other states. Governors and others took control of what they did in other states, whereas we did not. We kept control within ourselves. So you had that too. So there were different political dynamics in different states, whether you're blue, red, whether you're a mixture, whether it's whatever, right? So all of those dynamics were taken into consideration when we were looking at best practice of what to do and how to do it. Now, the interesting thing that's going to happen with all of us SHEOs, we're going to come together and say, how do we create a cookbook, if you will, because we know this is going to happen again, that we can use to think about higher ed in a more holistic way to help each one of us. And some of us may not be around forever, right? When new CEOs come in and they have to handle this issue, how can we give them our best knowledge to make it happen? So communication has been truly the key, but it's been regular communications, not every once in a while. It's been weekly communications, because this stuff changes so fast as the positivity rate does. And then how we can actually put in place quickly, if you will, any item that we feel that is worthy of putting in action.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think what you said about creating systems that allow us to support those new CEOs that come in, to create that menu of things, so that when we don't have to recreate the wheel. And so how can we support one another and disseminate some of those things that are working? So thank you for that. Well, to close this out, I wanted to ask you all, I know that this conversation can be somewhat a downer. We're continuing to talk about the pandemic. We're, 2 years in at this point. But I wanted to ask, what makes you hopeful coming out of this? What makes you hopeful? Where do you see successes maybe from your organizations, or where do you see hope light at the end of the tunnel? So just in 30 seconds, we'll do just a quick popcorn. So President Thompson, I saw you unmute. We'll start with you.
Sure. One thing makes me hopeful is this Omicron, although widely spread, it has not been as powerful. So things are working, right? And so that makes me hopeful. Number two is we're now having these sorts of discussions in a reasonable way to look at how we can serve our community based on where our community is at. We are having those discussions across all political dynamics. Number three, and this, scientist, I'm a researcher, right? And so I'm going to give higher ed a lot of kudos here. We are actually doing items in the clinical way that's going to help us to help those that are still affected, but those that could be affected with another pandemic. And number four, I'm going to say this carefully, but I'm going to say it, that many of us have looked at this truly. This was a wake-up call. So I'm hopeful that we all see it as a wake-up call. And so I'll leave that there with that final exclamation point.
Thank you for that. Melissa, we'll come to you. What are you hopeful for?
I want to save some time for Chelsea, so I'll add three things. I think our ability now to address many of the technology gaps that we see within our communities when we were forced to go virtual as higher ed institutions. I think the same with K through 12. We saw those structures and those inequalities in place, and those are being addressed. For my campus in particular, I think there are some administrative processes and procedures across higher ed. We used to walk paper around. When there was no paper to be walked around, we were forced to do it a different way. And I think we can implement now those strategies. And I think third is that, distance education and virtual education and how we teach our students will change forever based upon COVID. And I think it has improved tenfold and will continue to do so as we continue to have these conversations.
Great. Yes, so much the way we connect with students and the way we can disseminate the ability to educate folks. Chelsea, well, last but certainly not least, want to hear what you're most hopeful for.
I completely agree with what both speakers have shared previously in terms of hope and how we could really move forward with a lot of our advancements. But I think for me, when it comes to hopefulness, it's very simple. And I think it's what has made me hopeful is our need for stronger accountability. And I think having access to information, understanding the full story of many issues and disparities that are happening in our various communities. We have a stronger need and desire, especially among young people, for sound accountability. And I think we're at a point in time in history in which we're getting to a space and place in which we hopefully will be able to trust leadership in many different ways. And so our accountability is hopefully becoming stronger as we continue to question, inquire, and allow people to make decisions for us.
Thank you so much. This has just been a fantastic discussion. Thank you all both for joining us this discussion in your greater work. Higher education is better because of the work you all do. So thank you for that. As we close out, I just want to remind you of some upcoming webinars for the Hunt Institute. On Tuesday, we have using libraries to affirm racial identity and advance equity coming up. This is going to be a great conversation with Bates College, the School Library Journal, and the National Humanities Center. So I hope you'll join us for that. Then on Thursday, January 27th, we're going to dive into teacher residencies, the teacher residency return on investment, a pathway that prepares effective and diverse teachers who stay. We know teacher residencies across the nation are seeing low turnout, so how can we be better, more effective in using those? And then the first day of February, we'll turn to early efforts aligning state child care subsidy systems with the true cost of quality. Again, follow us on Twitter at Hunt Institute to stay updated with all the work we're doing. Thank you again to our panelists. We know that the environment around the pandemic will continue to evolve and change. So we appreciate you being on the front lines and being leaders for it. And we hope that as audience members, you took something that you can take back to your jobs or to your community to make the world a little better place. So with that, we'll close it out. Thank you all. And we look forward to seeing you on the next Post-Secondary Pathways.
Thank you, Wynn. Thanks, everybody. Talk to you soon.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Well.
Yeah.